The four horsemen of the apocalypse is probably the most widely referenced piece of the book of Revelation in our popular culture. And not just in old blues songs like the one the band did, and not just in Johnny Cash songs either, but it pops up all over the place. A lot in Westerns. I don't think that's on accident. There's a Clint Eastwood movie from 1985 called The Pale Rider, where he's death and hell follows after him. And then there's the same reference in Tombstone when one of the characters actually quotes, "I saw a rider on a pale horse, and his name was Death, and hell followed with him." And then, of course, they put it in Wyatt Earp's mouth. You tell him the law's coming. You tell him I'm coming, and hell's coming with me. It's a direct reference to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It also shows up a lot in sports. There are a group of running backs and the quarterback from Notre Dame in the 20s, known as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. There was a Celtics basketball team that four of their five guys were called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's got to make that fifth guy feel like a chump. And then just a few years ago, the defensive line for one of the SEC teams was called the Four Horsemen. And I remember hearing this on the radio, and I looked it up this week, and I can't find it. But it was it was like one Old Miss or somebody that isn't Alabama. But their defensive line called themselves the Four Horsemen. I was a part of a group of guys in high school that our principal called the Five Horsemen. He got the number wrong, but I think this is what he was referencing because to him we represented like destruction. And there were like 9 of us anyway, so he wasn't very good with math. But it shows up a lot, like in our popular mind, and I don't think it's because it's particularly powerful or particularly well understood. I think it shows up a lot for 2 reasons. The first one is that it's ominous without being creepy. I mean, like there's a sense in the four horsemen of the apocalypse of like impending doom or at least some kind of destruction, but it's not as creepy as 666, which is the other one that shows up, but only like in heavy metal circles, and so we get to ignore them. I think it's just ominous without being creepy, and also because it's first. This is where the action starts in the book of Revelation. These 4 riders come out. The first 4 seals are broken, and then at the end of the seals, they blow trumpets, and at the trumpets, they pour out bowls, and things start happening, and there are like dragon beasts, and there's like a giant woman, and there's like all these crazy images. Like the book assaults you with images. That's actually why I have so many images up front here, because that's what the book does. It just puts image after image after image in front of you. And by the time that you get to the end, you're kind of confused. And most of us, the last thing we can make sense out of was 4 dudes on horseback. And so this is what comes up in our brain. We start referencing the book of Revelation as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But there's something here for us to see and for us to learn. And so I think we can get at it with 3 questions. I think if we ask, what's going on, who's doing it, and why does that matter, we're going to get at the depth and the reason for this image being in the book of Revelation. So the first question is, what's going on? And when we look at it, we kind of get it. This is an image of warfare. It starts with the first horse or the first rider rides out to conquer. And we know that war starts with someone's desire to conquer. It says he's wearing a crown. And someone, usually a dude who thinks he's in charge, goes out to conquer someone else, and this is where wars start. Follows that is the horse with the sword, or the rider with the sword on the red horse. And we know that is followed by physical violence of one kind or another. Then along with war, it's not just the physical violence, but it's the economic disruption. When the rider comes out with a scale in his hand and it says, this much wheat for this much money and this much barley for this much money, those are crazy inflated prices. Like 3 to 10 times the price you would pay in the day, depending on where you were and what the year's harvest was like and things like that. But we know that when war comes, there's economic distress that follows after it. For decades after World War II, which England was on the winning side, there was rationing and there was hunger in England. We wonder why all these white guys from England were able to adapt the blues like John the Revelator and become the British invasion into America, playing our music back to us. It's because they were poor and hungry like the African-American community that invented the blues in the U.S. So we know that kind of hunger and economic distress follows war. And we also know that this last horse, the one, they call him pale green, but it's a Greek word that means the color of a corpse. That the end result of war is death, and not just from the sword, but from disease and pestilence and hunger and famine. So when we look at the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we see that it's about warfare. But the first audience, the people who heard this read aloud to them in the first century, would have seen at least two other layers to it. One is they would have seen it as a reference to a specific kind of warfare. And there are people that disagree with this, but I've been convinced by the scholars that think this is specifically referencing the attack on a walled city. Cities used to have walls around them. Our most common reference to this today is the Battle of Minas Tirith at the end of the first three, of the three Lord of the Rings movies. And there's the big white castle, and it's got a giant wall. And it takes the armies of Mordor, there's like millions of them all marching on it, because you got to get through the wall. And people in the first century knew this. This is the kind of warfare they were used to. You would have this desire to conquer. You'd go out and you'd commit physical violence, and you'd try to disrupt the other person's economy. And then you would surround their city, and everything would show up in microcosm. You just had to surround them. And if you had a big enough army and you surrounded them, you'd cut them off. And inside the walled city, you would run out of food, and the prices would start skyrocketing. People would start getting sick. You killed a couple of people on the edge of the wall, and then you've got sick people, and you've got disease just spreading around. And you defeated them by cutting them off, and then eventually the city would fall, and the people inside would die not just from violence, but from disease and hunger and all these other things. So this is a specific reference to it, and they knew it because the first people to read this would have known the story of if they weren't Jewish themselves, they would have been adopted into this very Jewish Christian church. And so they would have known the story, the collective identity of the people who were once beaten by the Babylonians. 500 years before Jesus, the Babylonians were the biggest power in the world, and they were attacking the Israelites, and they defeated their outer armies. They surround Jerusalem, and they cut them off. People start to die from violence, petulance, hunger. The economy completely collapses. They're defeated, and these people are kidnapped and carried off into exile and forced to live in Babylon. And so the identity of the Jews in the first century, we are the ones who came home from Babylon. But they only got to come home when Babylon itself was defeated by the Persians, who defeated their armies, surrounded their walled city, committed violence, economic distress, hunger, disease, and death. And then they said, look, we don't need you. You guys can go back to Judea. So the Jews came home. And then they thought when the Romans took over that one day they would go and defeat Rome. But maybe 20 years before this book was written, in the year 70 AD, there was a man who led a revolt. They thought maybe Jesus would do this. That when they wanted him to be the Messiah that was leading the revolt against Rome and he wouldn't do it, they found somebody who would do it. And they won a couple of little battles. And then Rome sent in 60,000 troops, surrounded Jerusalem, and once again quickly demolished it and destroyed the temple. They knew the tactic and the violence and the disruption involved in the attack on the walled city. So that's one layer that they would have known it from their real life. And that's one of the layers they would have seen at work in this story. But the second one, I think, is interesting. So the first horse is a white horse with a rider carrying a bow. And that's a description of a Parthian warrior. The Parthians were a group of people that in most Western history classes, they were just wrapped into the Persian. If you learned about the Persian Empire, they just wrapped the Parthians into it. But they were kind of a subset. And the Parthians were the outer edge of the Roman Empire, what's now modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Iran, kind of depending on where the line went. But the Romans never could quite beat them, and so they did kind of the same thing they did with the Scottish. Like, they just built a wall and said, look, you stay on your side, we'll stay on our side, we'll just agree to disagree. But the Parthians wouldn't stay on their side, and in 70 BC, they started attacking the Romans, and they beat a couple of little garrisons and a couple of outposts. And so the Romans sent thousands upon thousands of troops, and they were going to go wipe out the Parthians. The Parthians rode in on their white horses with their bows, and they won. Every attack on Rome after this was built on that chink in the Roman army, in the Roman armor. The Parthians fell apart because of internal struggles, but they had beaten Rome in a full frontal attack. And so right here in this story, we get this image of what's wrong with violence and warfare. We get this, the desire to conquer leads to violence, leads to disruption, leads to death. That's what we're offered. And they're offered this condemnation of the Roman way of doing it, because in the Jewish mind, that's the biggest violence they've seen was this attack on Jerusalem. But there's also a bit of the promise that Rome is not all powerful. There's already a hint that Rome will fall. That's the central message of the next several chapters of this book. Rome is going to fall. And so for all those Jews that were, and all those Christians, that were being oppressed by the Roman Empire and weren't being allowed to worship and were being left out and mistreated, they're all being comforted by this message: Rome is going to fall. And for all those who were putting all their trust and getting fat and happy off of the peace and the success of the Roman Empire, it's a warning. Look, you have put your eggs in the wrong basket. That's what's going on. That's what's happening in this thing. It's a condemnation of violence along with this hint that Rome is going to fall. The second question is, who's doing it? It's already confusing because we've mentioned the Parthians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Jews, the Romans. We've mentioned all these people, but the real question when you start looking at this chapter, you're wondering who's doing it, is God defeating Rome? And the deeper question is God killing off these people? That's a question worth asking. That's a question we want to know the answer to. And the answer we get from the book of Revelation is, no, not really. That's as much as we get. It's not that, but that's what they are given, is a no, not really. Because these riders on these horses, the ones that are going out to conquer and destroy and cause death, they're not messengers from heaven and they're not angels. There's two words used in the Greek, maybe three. Anyway, it's all translated as angels in English, but there's two different words for messengers and for angels that are throughout the book of Revelation. These are the people carrying out the will of God, and those words aren't used for the riders. They're just riders. And it's also very ambiguous on where they're coming from and where they're going to. And you see, that's because this is an apocalypse and not an allegory. One of the big mistakes we make when we try to read Revelation as telling the future, like a roadmap to what's going to happen next, is that would make it an allegory, meaning everything in the story relates to something specific in real life every time. One of the best known allegories we've got is the Chronicles of Narnia. How many of you saw at least one of the Chronicles of Narnia movies? Has anybody read the books? I've not read the books. But in the Chronicles of Narnia, every character in the book represents something in our faith and life every time. So every time Aslan shows up, he's God, and he represents God. And every time that certain characters show up, every time the kids show up, every time certain helpers and enemies show up, they represent a certain part of our lived out faith and life together with God every time. It's a direct allegory. And there's people that disagree with that, but that's kind of what C.S. Lewis was going for. He's a good enough storyteller, he bends it a little bit. But that's how allegories work. But this is an apocalypse, and they don't work that way. We've got a rider at the beginning of this story that represents Rome and the Parthians all at one time. And what an apocalypse is trying to do is trying to give you an overall impression of the deeper nature of reality. And so the overall impression we're given is that of warfare that's free and flexible enough to represent all warfare and to condemn it as the wrong way to go. See, God has a path that leads to life. And this says that the way of warfare leads to death. That's the overall impression that we're given. And so God is not the one out there killing people. But God's not off the hook here either. That's why I say it's no, not really. Because it is the angels who call out, come, as the riders arrive and start doing their work. And they're saying, come or come forward as the seals are being broken by the Lamb and opening up the scroll that represents God's will going to happen. So what we're left with is the sense that God's not doing it, but God is allowing it. And that is a tough thing to teach. It's a tough thing to say to the world, that God is allowing this kind of violence to happen. And this is not an explanation of why all human suffering happens. That's not what they're trying to go for. This is specifically about warfare. and specifically about the warfare being experienced and the violence being experienced by the Christians in the first century. And it's saying that God is allowing this to happen. There's an end to this book. God's allowing it to happen for a time, and then there's going to be a solution. But to be honest, there are days when that's the best we've got. Because the other options that the Christians would be left with is that God didn't know it was happening or God didn't care it was happening. This says that God is there with you. God is a part of this. And some will experience suffering. They've already been told that in the letters at the beginning. Some of you will experience persecution. But there's a promise that there's an end to it, and there's a promise that God is aware and God is present. It's a reminder that the things that we do, like that God has left choices up to us, and we get to decide how we're going to act, which path we're going to follow. And it's a reminder that the choices that we make really make a difference. Like the problems that we cause aren't just little problems. Some of them lead to violence and conquering and pestilence and death. Like that we, when we make mistakes, that we have turned ourselves to the wrong path. And so it reminds us that God allows us to make choices, even when those choices are destructive. But it's also this book exists as an act of grace. It's God's comfort to those who are being oppressed by the violence, and the warning to those of us who are on this path towards death that, look, you can turn. There's time to choose the way of life. And so even as we say, who's doing it? Well, God's not doing it. We have to say that in this case, the book is telling us God's allowing it. But that's better than knowing or thinking that God's ignoring it. And in this case, that's the best we've got. The final question is, why does it matter what happened to the Jews in the first century and the Christians in the first century? Why are we worried about it today? What difference does it make tomorrow? And the reason that it matters is because the message is bigger than Rome. The real message of this book, of this and of these images, is that all human governments fall. Stick with me for a minute. That's what this is about. Remember, the first image that we were given at the beginning of the book is of Jesus. This is one like the Son of Man. And then as John describes the Son of Man, he does it in ways that remind us of the book of Daniel and these series of visions that are going on in the book of Daniel. And there's monsters and there's beasts and there's statues and there's all these things in these different visions. But all the visions are either of or for a king of Babylon. And the point of every one of them is that your kingdom will fall. It's a reminder, just like the ones that have come before you, there are always beasts that represent the one before that beast and then the ones after. All the kingdoms that have come before you, the kingdoms that come after you are going to fall. And what's important is the one who does not fall, the one who's eternal. You need to worship Yahweh. You need to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the king of Babylon is told over and over in Daniel. And that's the first place that the book of Revelation draws our mind, is to remind us that human institutions fall. Is this also the real reason why so few people talk about Revelation in the church? There are tons of people that don't read Revelation as a roadmap, who look at it and say, this is not a map to the future. That's not how this book is supposed to work. So what else is it supposed to do? And you start looking at it and you start finding things that are really complicated, tricky, unpopular to say. But they're worth saying. That's why they're in the book. So I'm going to talk for like 3 more minutes, and you're going to have to give me grace for 2 of them, because I'm going to say some things that are tricky and difficult to say. Because when I say all governments fall, if I stand up here and say America is going to fall, it sounds like I'm making a political statement. I don't think America is going to fall tomorrow, but given hundreds of years, every other institution in human history has collapsed, or at least reduced in its size and importance and all that. So we've got to assume it's going to happen to us. And when I say that, it sounds like I'm making a political statement. And if I were making a political statement, then we've got 2 dangers of how to react to it. One is that you hate me for saying that, and 2 is that you love me for all the wrong reasons. I mean, you start talking about using the condemnations that we've got of violence and of Rome in this book, and I start condemning and I start saying America's going to fall. The Democrats will love me if I stand up here and say, it's all about anti-war, and it's a condemnation of violence, and we need to be opposed to that. But if I use a different set of catchphrases, and I start talking about the images in this book and what we're talking about, the Republicans will love me if they hear me saying it's a condemnation of trust in a big human power. But when I say all human governments fall, it's not a political statement. It's a statement of faith in the one who doesn't fall. It's a statement of faith in the one who does things differently. In the last chapter, we read about the lamb who showed up instead of the lion. That it's God's sacrifice that allows a way forward. And if we put all of our hope into human power, we've pointed ourselves in the wrong direction, because it's God's way that never fails. It's God's way that will overcome and will save. The book of Revelation involves politics, but it's not a book about politics. It's a book about the deeper nature of reality, in which politics is just a little bit. And so when we read this and we start thinking about the fact that it's reminding us all human institutions fail, it allows us to see politics in a different light. It reminds us that it's important. It matters what we do in the world around us. But it also reminds us that in the United States, we don't have a Christian party. That both of our political parties get some things right in terms of righteousness and justice and hope. And both of our political parties get some things wrong when it comes to righteousness and hope and justice. And so it reminds us that we can be involved in politics, that these things matter, but we've got a freedom to disagree with one another on that, because we're talking about the deeper nature of reality, within which our two political parties are this far apart. And so it's important for us to be involved in this, and we can vote and we can move, but this is not an issue of justice. It's not an issue of life and death. It's an issue of making things a little bit better from each of our perspectives. And what's really at issue is faith. Do we have the faith in God that allows us to be people of peace and people of hope and people of love, regardless of what our government is doing? Are we trusting in God's power to make us, our lives, our worlds, our families, our neighborhoods more like the kingdom of God? I tell you, it gets really tricky and really uncomfortable when you start talking about what this book is really showing you. But human institutions will fall apart. They will. And if we have the blessing that we don't live in the Roman Empire. We don't live in a place where we are told exactly how and when to worship and forced to worship a person instead of a God. We don't live in an empire bent on world domination, but we live in a nation where we are protected by violence. And honestly, that's probably the best we've got in the world where we live. That's probably as close as we're going to get today to justice and hope, and the closest we're going to get in this world today. We've got to, I'm not condemning our government for being there, but it's a reminder that the human institution is on the road towards failing. It's a reminder that there's something deeper and there's something better in the world. There's something bigger than the disagreements we have over politics. There's something that matters, and that's the God who comes to us and allows us to be people of faith and justice in our own homes and in our own families and in our own communities. It's the God who allows us to be people of strength and courage, to speak out on what's right and what's wrong. It's the God who comes to us and gives us this book as an act of grace to say, look, those of you who are depressed, those of you who are terrified by the level of violence in the world around you, I know. I see it. I'm right there with you, and I have a plan to take care of it. And for those of us who are trusting the way of violence to keep us safe, it's a warning. This way leads on to death, and there's a better way. You don't have to put all your hope here. You can put your hope in the God who never fails. Pray with me.